Before we start, I'm just curious, how many people are from Virginia? Okay. How many people are from outside of Virginia? Okay, looks like the same people. How many people have come from west of the Mississippi? Any people? Wow, okay. How many people have come from north of Mason-Dixon line here? Okay. How many people here think that Thomas Jefferson was the smartest man who was ever president of the United States? Okay. How many people here think Thomas Jefferson could get elected president today? Right. All right. How many people here are descendants of Thomas Jefferson? Could you stand up? All right. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making this a much more enjoyable occasion by your being here. So let's start. Why don't we start with Tom? Tom, you've written a famous book about the greatest generation, and talking about World War II veterans and what they did. And obviously, it transformed much of the way that people think about the World War II generation. How would you compare the World War II generation to the generation of people who fought to create this country in the Revolutionary War period of time, including Thomas Jefferson? What would be the differences or similarities, would you say?
Well, I think there were two different experiences. One was the greatest war in the history of mankind, World War II, and nothing less than than free-loving people everywhere were at stake in that war. And that generation came out of the Great Depression, black, white, and Hispanic. I often say that the reason that we were so successful in World War II was in part because of the experiences of the Great Depression. They were used to sacrifice. They were the can-do generation. They learned how to do things on the fly, how to repair machinery, how to invent new things out in the farmland. So many of the veterans that I talked to, when I would say, what do you remember about basic training? They said, couldn't believe the breakfast. My God, you know, all you wanted to eat. I got my first new pair of boots. The first time I didn't have hand-me-down trousers. The founding fathers that gave us, Mr. Jefferson so aptly described, were of a more intellectual bent. And they, in their own way, changed the world in language and in law and in the recognition, as I said last night, that every citizen has a free will and it doesn't depend on birthright or on conquest. That was an astonishing change and a message that went around the world, and it began with Mr. Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. So I think that they both had enormous impact, but in different disciplines. And I like to think that they would have admired each other. You know, we now talk about the founding fathers as if they were one kumbaya group. That was not true at all. In fact, there were spirited differences between them about the direction in which they would go. President Adams, for example, was still fairly attached to the idea of the royal courtesies of the court and didn't know quite how to address the president. So there was that great mix, but it was very cerebral. The greatest generation, I get challenged on that a lot, and my short answer is, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. The longer answer is that the fact is that across a broad spectrum of American life, they did not only save the world, but that they changed how we think of our lives in this country. Sure, there were bad guys in the greatest generation. There were people who came back from that war with too much hubris and led us into Vietnam. But I like to remind people that the greatest generation also included those who were the outspoken foes of Vietnam. And to a degree that is not sufficiently acknowledged on my part, I think, African Americans who came back from World War II came back determined not to be second-class citizens again. They performed heroically in their own combat units and on ships and in the skies, as we know with the Tuskegee Airmen. And they became, in a way, the underpinning of Dr. King's movement. They came back and they had performed so heroically that no one could dispute that or acknowledge in any way that they had not been full-fledged citizens. They wanted to make more sacrifices for their country. And when I said to one of them, who was in an army unit attached to Patton, I said, how did you put up with all that discrimination? He said, it's my country. This is where I belong. And I wanted it to be better. And I was willing to make a sacrifice to save us from the Germans. But I wanted to come home and make sure that we were rewarded simply with equal rights as citizens. I thought it was a very eloquent statement.
Okay, Tom, let me ask you, in your political background, in terms of when you covered politicians, when you were at the White House covering politicians, so forth, you've met a lot of people running for president. To be very serious, could somebody like Thomas Jefferson today possibly get elected president of the United States?
You know, I honestly think that he probably could. I think the country longs for someone who can rise above the pettiness that we see in so much of our presidential politics, who has a kind of philosophical approach to America. One can say that when President Obama ran, the country took a look at him and said, this is an opportunity for us to have a really bright guy who happens to be the first African American who is seriously contending for the presidency. And I think where the president, and where the White House went wrong, and I've said this to him in private conversations, not to him directly, but to his staff, President Obama pulled a lot of centrists and just right of center Republicans across the line in that election. They voted for him. And unfortunately, once he got into office, he didn't, I think, pay enough attention to that centered group in America. I'm not talking about the Mitch McConnells and the professional politicians on the Hill who set out to blockade against him. And I really think it was, in part, the result of his not having a lot of experience as a politician. Bill Clinton, in the same circumstances, would have reached out to the Republicans who did vote for him and create a separate kind of coalition, if you will. I thought it was a big miss on the part of President Obama that he didn't acknowledge and reward in some fashion those people who helped get him into office. And they were acutely disappointed. I'll just tell you one quick story. A friend of mine is the ex-Republican Attorney General of South Dakota. Not a wildly conservative man, but a true Republican in every sense of the word. And before the election, about a week before we were pheasant hunting, I was getting ready to come back to Washington. And he and a U.S. attorney for the state was a very law and order guy, walked out with me and said, what do you think? And I said, I can't tell you how to vote, but always one of the best tests for me is to close your eyes and think, who do you want in the Oval Office during a time of crisis? Just imagine that for yourself, whether it's a war or a natural catastrophe or an economic meltdown. Who would you be most comfortable with? You decide. And I walked away. They both voted for Obama. And within 8 months, they came to me and said, what the hell is this all about? You know, we're not getting the attention that we think. I think that with his very deft touch as a politician that Jon has written about so brilliantly, that Thomas Jefferson would be able to ride up over a lot of the pettiness that we see today. I really do.
So Rex, can I ask you, you're an expert in many different areas of history and Monticello. Do you think the fascination with Monticello is that it is a brilliantly designed house, and it was a great example of a plantation that was working in Virginia, or that the fact that a person who could become president of the United States had the intellectual ability to actually design a house? So is it more because somebody could get elected president who had these abilities to be an architect, or is it just the house itself? Forget that he was president of the United States. What do you think is the fascination with Monticello?
I think the fascination with Monticello is that he was a Renaissance man, that he could do so many things well. I think he was a statesman. I think he was an author. I think he was an intellectual. I think he was a scientist, obviously a slave owner. And I think all of those roles that he played exceedingly well. And I think that there are people who see someone with that kind of optimism, somebody with that kind of humanity, as someone that they wanted to rule and govern them. I know that when I think about him and I think about the variety of those who owned enslaved communities during that period of time, I don't know anyone that said to the I think it's around 20 overseers that he had, I don't want you to punish these people. I don't want you to physically punish them, because I don't want them to work because they are afraid. I want them to work because there's a motivation beyond that. I don't know anybody else who did that. Everybody else said 39 lashes well laid on, but he did not. And so I think it was his humanity that not only connected with whites, but I think it also connected with many African Americans. When I think of those African Americans who went on and did wonderful things, many of them were a part of that small community. If you asked me if I thought that Thomas Jefferson would have been part of the group that said Black Lives Matter, I would tell you no, I don't. But if you asked me if there were things about his personality, about his humanity, that in some way connected to a portion of those Black lives that he felt mattered, I'd say to you, yes. I'd say Jon Hemings. I'd say Joseph Fossum. I'd say there are a variety of people, Jon Hemings, who looked and who connected with him in a way that he acknowledged, and he used that relationship with them, not only for his advantage, but for their advantage as well.
So you had an exhibition at the Smithsonian that dealt with the paradox of the situation that Thomas Jefferson wrote a sentence, that most famous sentence in the English language: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And when he wrote that sentence, he had 2 slaves with him at the time in Philadelphia. He had many slaves back here, and he lived as a slave owner, yet he was saying all men are created equal. How in his own mind did he put these 2 concepts together? You can be a slave owner, but think everybody should be equal.
I think he thought those that he felt could be responsible citizens should be equal. I don't think that he felt that the African American community or that the enslaved community could be citizens in the sort of definition that he had of it, that they understood the political scene, that they were educated, that they were able to make informed decisions. I think that he felt many of them were children. He wrote about that, and that he felt that they were not developed in a way. He said, I don't know of any Black that I would consider, I'm paraphrasing him, of course, I don't think that there's any Black that I know, that I see and that I respect as being an intellectual, but I know many who have hearts that are greater than most people I know. So he understood their humanity, he understood them as people, but he never felt that they could sort of rise to the level that he felt needed to be accorded the right of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
So John, when he was in Philadelphia writing the Declaration of Independence, like many people were given an assignment, he waited to the end. So he had maybe 17 days, and he said, I'll wait till the end. And 3 or 4 days to go, right?
Coffee.
Right, 3 or 4 days to go. He's sitting there in his non-air-conditioned apartment writing out. How did he actually write this with no notes, no books? And after he wrote it, what was the reaction from the people to whom he gave it?
Well, the Declaration of Independence is the world's most famous subcommittee report. I mean, I suspect everyone in this tent has suffered on a subcommittee at some point or another. When you're sitting there and you're really, really unhappy, you're operating in a Jeffersonian tradition, because he was the man who was assigned to essentially write the press release for the Continental Congress. Remember, John Adams ceded the authority of writing the Declaration in one of John Adams's many PR mistakes. We all aren't at Braintree in a tent, are we? Even on July 4th, 1826, he lost the headline to Jefferson. Poor man. Of all things, you could at least get a death day out of it, but no. John Adams.
They died within a couple hours of each other.
They did.
50 years to the day.
They did, exactly. And Adams thought he would at least get a news cycle with Brokaw.
Right.
You've got to remember that in my eyes, Jon Meacham is just a young whippersnapper.
And then,
I have to expect that.
Right. I thought what you and Jane did with that death day was great. So Adams, David asked about descendants, how many attorneys are in the room? Oh, good, okay, that's actually a good sign. Well, John Adams had the vices of his virtues. He was a lawyer, and so he believed that we would be celebrating, as the founding of the independence of the country, the constitution of the state governments from colonial governments to standalone governments. That is a lawyer's sense of a holiday occasion. Jefferson saw something different and sat there in that bricklayer's house, the Graff House in Philadelphia, wrote the Declaration, had a lot of stuff around him. it was, as he put it, less an original composition than an expression of the American mind. That was his phrase. He believed that he was speaking for a people, as we've talked about, as he defined that idea of people. And, you know, we quote the self-evident phrase. Self-evident was Benjamin Franklin's. Remember, Jefferson's initial phrase was that it was a sacred truth, not a self-evident one, which is interesting given his rather eclectic religious views. Thomas Jefferson was the perfect Episcopalian, which is not an oxymoron, which Tom and I sometimes think is true.
So when the committee, he
Yeah.
gave this to his committee, which John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were on the subcommittee, and then they ultimately
Sherman.
turned it in to the Continental Congress. And then what happened when it was taken up on July the 3rd initially for the debate?
It is left there, it's passed. It is now, I don't know if anyone here has ever had to write for the committee itself, but Jefferson is said to have been so frustrated by the edits of the group that his leg was bouncing up with such irritation that Franklin reached over and tried to steady him. As an author, I have great sympathy for that. So there was a lot of collective editing, which I'm sure made it better.
Did Thomas Jefferson ever speak up and say you're making a mistake?
No, and one of the interesting things about the political style of Jefferson is he almost never spoke up. There are no great speeches of Thomas Jefferson. What he did, like all great political figures, is he mastered the means of communication of his day. And so the Declaration of Independence is the embodiment of this, but so is the Virginia Act for Religious Liberty. So are so many other things. He wrote the announcement that we were accepting the Treaty of Paris. So the war that he began in July of '76, as a member of the Confederation Congress, he helped end. He knew, and in fact, both Adams and Franklin approved of this, grudgingly to some extent, that most people, when you're in a political setting, do not change their minds after you get up and say you're wrong. Right? How many times in Congress has someone said, you know what, he's exactly right, I'm going to change my vote? It's not a widely shared political habit. And so Adams himself recognized that Jefferson had brilliantly mastered writing quickly and well in what was a society in which the central means of political communication was the published word. And so in the same way that Franklin Roosevelt mastered the radio and John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan mastered television, Jefferson's capacity to write quickly and well in incredibly important moments gave him a certain measure of power. If you write the announcement of the decision of a deliberative body, you are shaping that decision.
Well, final point on this, or question on this. When they have the debate in the Continental Congress about his Declaration of Independence, of course, the most famous part, the preamble, is more or less ignored. Right. And most of the attention is paid to Jefferson's description that King George forced slavery on the colonies. And why did he write that if he was a slave owner? Right. And why did they take it out if he was such an ardent advocate for that position?
Right. They took it out because all politics is local, and there was an extraordinary number of people who were not interested in litigating the politics of slavery in that particular document, both the slave-owning interests in the South and those, in the phrase of the time, who had enriched themselves by trafficking in human enslaved communities. So it was something they didn't want to get into at that moment. My own view, and with Senator here, I feel it's like trying to do TV with Brokaw. You know, this is a total imbalance. But you know, Jefferson. One of the tragedies of Thomas Jefferson, to be blunt, to go to Rex's point, is this is a man who saw into the future in so many different ways. He saw the West. He saw the rise of the American power. He saw the need for education, for an engaged citizenry to support the Republican experiment. He saw ahead on everything except the issue of race in America. He actually, I believe, could not imagine the world in which we live now. And yet he imagined the world in which we live now in so many other ways. And so it's to some extent, I think we should celebrate him for seeing ahead so much. condemning him for failing to break the bonds of that particular moment and see forward in the way that it's taken us so long, and as we see from the news today, it's still taking us.
John,
we're not there.
How much of that was the culture in which he was raised from the beginning of his life, that it was a fixed part of the plantations in the South, and also it was a political consideration because they didn't want to lose the South at the beginning.
Right.
How much of that do you think his attitude to slavery was a kind of bipolar, if you will, view of the world? He saw the importance of not having birthright. He saw the importance of looking to the future. But he'd grown up with the idea of slavery, and in his mind, it was a kind of benign force, in fact, because of the way they were treated here.
Right. Well, he did try on 3 or 4 occasions as a young man to reform the institution, and he failed each time. There was one legal case in which he had tried to do it. There was a case in local politics and state politics, and there was the example David mentions of losing that section of the Declaration. And my central argument about Jefferson is that, yes, he was a Renaissance man. Yes, he was arguably the most accomplished American, but he was fundamentally a politician. For 40 years, from 1765 until he came back in 1809, he was almost entirely in public office or thinking about it. Now, no president ever spoke in needlepoint pillow terms better than Thomas Jefferson. The lines about if only I could return to Monticello, return to my books, return to my daughters. Well, the road was open. He could do it. He was drawn inexorably to public life. And I believe that his early experiences in failing to reform slavery shaped him because politicians don't like to lose.
Tom, last night you gave a compelling talk about great ideas that have changed society, and one of them was the idea that everybody is equal, which was a novel idea at the time. Can you describe and elaborate on why that was so novel and why the idea that all people are created equal, even leaving aside the slavery issue, was a novel idea at the time? Tom?
I think that's very hard for us to understand now about what the political climate was, what the practices were, what the investment they felt very strongly about in terms of the economy and how things would operate once you got south of the Mason-Dixon line. So I think it's very, very hard for us to put ourselves in that place and understand the place of slavery. Slavery had been going on for a long time, but by the time they got to it and trying to codify something in which all men would be created equal, but, oh, by the way, off to the side, we'll keep the slaves as they are. I've tried to put myself in their mindset once you got south of Boston. And, if I come back to what I said earlier, I think so many of them had just grown up with it, and it was so much a part of the fabric of their lives, economically and otherwise.
If you forget slavery for one moment, the idea that all white people are to be created equal was a novel concept. And I thought what you were saying last night is the idea of equality for all citizens, let's say just white citizens, that was a novel idea itself.
Well, it was more than a novel idea. In fact, it was in the long cosmic history of people, it was a stunning breakthrough. Everybody had lived in some form of regal rule in which there had been a king in every country. And even though they'd made some steps toward more democratic rule in England, they still were ruled by the king. And you go to the subcontinent of Asia or you go through Africa, almost every country had the ruling family. So that was a stunning breakthrough, that birthright had nothing to do with who you were. It was just that if you were born, you had free will and you had an opportunity to exercise whatever political judgment you wanted. What we've left out here is that they didn't also acknowledge women, frankly. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't come up in many of the discussions. And yet some of the strongest women, Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Madison, were critically important to the discussion and the intellectual ferment of the time. So they left out a whole gender as well.
In other words, all white men who have property are created equal,
Right.
more or less.
Right. But David, can I say,
Yes, John.
And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way.
only Brokaw can get away with that. This is a man you would pay to hear read the phone book. So, But I think it has to be put in to go to Tom's point, the broadest possible context. What was going on in the 150, 200, 300 years before the American Revolution? The Protestant Reformations, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, the rise of the bourgeoisie in Europe, the idea that destiny was not determined at the moment of your birth, but was actually a malleable force. And in many ways, the American Revolution, without being overly romantic about it, was the political manifestation of the most fundamental shift in intellectual and cultural thought in Western history, which was that princes and popes did not have the power to tell you what to think. And you cannot separate, I believe, the American Revolution or Jefferson's thought from the rise of religious liberty and the freeing of that sense of institutional authority as well.
I can't help but think, though, about the atmosphere that the enslaved grew up in and lived in from generation to generation. And as I think about the American Revolution and the enslaved finding out very shortly that the American Revolution had nothing to do with their freedom. It had to do with a freedom, but it had nothing to do with their freedom. And I can't help but think about the end of the revolution as being, for that enslaved community, a continuation of everything that they hoped would be eliminated, and that eliminated for them as well. I'm sure many of them thought, all men are created. That means us as well. So there was a hope that was created during the Revolutionary era that in some way was gone before the revolution was won. And it makes me think of the variety of people who did not allow that to stand in the way of how they would proceed with their lives. Case in point, Joseph Fossum was the grandson of Elizabeth Hemings. Joseph Fossum was a blacksmith. He was a very accomplished blacksmith. But in 1827, when the auction took place and 130 some odd African Americans were put on the auction, even though Fossum was set free, and his freedom didn't come until June or July, he had to watch his family be sold off. But rather than allow that to happen, his thinking, and did he get this from Jefferson? Where did he get it from? Is part of it his own kind of innate ability that said, where I begin is not where I'm going to end? I don't know. But what Joe did was he knew folk, because he was a blacksmith, he knew folk around in the Charlottesville area. So he asked several of them if they would purchase his family, so that when he got a chance, he would purchase them back. 1827, he couldn't buy any of them. He didn't have the money, number one, but number two, he wasn't freed until, I think it was July. So he couldn't even bid on them. 1837, he bought back 5 of his family members and 4 of his grandchildren. One of his sons, Peter, was still enslaved, even though he asked these folk, when you take my children, please allow me to purchase them back. One man who had his son Peter said, no, you can't have him back. Peter was enslaved for over 20 years from the time of 27 until he freed himself. But he freed himself. And in 1837, not only did he buy back 9 of his family, but they all went to Ohio. And then Peter, not supposed to teach anybody to read, he did. Not supposed to help anybody escape, he wrote manumission papers for his sister. Not supposed to do anything that said, my humanity is so ingrained in me, and I know that this is not my future. I have another one. I am going to do all I can. He taught others to read. And then finally, in 1850, he was freed and joined his family. That says to me that humanity, that says to me that family, that says to me that what he must have learned while he was on that hill, and what he must not have learned while he was on that hill, that gave him the determination that I'm going to one day be with my family and we are going to be free, was so ingrained in him until he made it happen. That, to me, is just as important as talking about Thomas Jefferson, because what it said is that ability to see beyond the moment and to find a way, to make a way out of no way, was ingrained in many of the enslaved at Monticello, and they succeeded. How do we know? Because they are family members now who are the legacy of those people who refused to give up.
I think, David, that is one of the most insightful and important descriptions of what was going on in the slave community that I have ever heard. And the fact is, it's very often a very large gap between that kind of thinking and how the white majority at that time and even now didn't understand what was going on. I never failed to come here and look down at the slave quarters and wonder, what do they talk about at night? What was it like at the end of a hard day to go in there and have a discussion, and how they cared about each other and took care of each other? And we don't know enough about that, quite honestly. There's no written record. There's a kind of oral history of it. But we desperately need in this country that kind of dialogue, even now, in my judgment.
Rex, let's talk about the other part of the Hemings family. It is said that Thomas Jefferson had a relationship with Sally Hemings for some 40 years or so, fathered 6 children or so. Is there any doubt in your mind that that occurred? And why do you think some people are still determined to say that this did not happen?
Well, I think there are a lot of folk who, revisionist historians, who want to believe and want to sort of maintain the iconic nature of Jefferson. For me, looking at Jefferson clearly as the three-dimensional person he was, helps me understand him and helps me understand the world in which he lived. I think if you look at the evidence, you look at the data, you look at the DNA, you look at a variety of work that Cinder and her colleagues have done over time, it's very hard to look at that and to assume that there weren't these connections between Jefferson and Beverly and Harriet and Madison and Eston. It is just the evidence for me is irrefutable. But you know, again, Sally Hemings is important, but Sally Hemings is only a small part of the story. And when you said what you said, well, somebody said, I think it was Annette Gordon Reed said that she was the most famous African American of the 18th century. But there were, as I said, many other things. I don't want you to leave here seeing the African American community as a one-dimensional community. Her uncle was Jon Hemings. Jon Hemings in 1830 was looking at his wife Priscilla. Priscilla was not feeling well at all. Priscilla, they didn't have any children. Priscilla was ill. John was attending to her as much as he possibly could. One night, she's getting worse and she's getting worse. He's reading to her from the Bible. He's reading to her from the Bible. She loses consciousness, wakes up, and then says to him, there are 3 things under the looking glass I want you to go and see. He takes her, he goes there, and there is a cravat, there is a crepe hat band, a band for his hat, and there is a lock of her hair. Shortly after that, several days, she passed away. He wrote or carved on her tombstone that she was a beloved wife. 3 years later, not able to see, but still a fairly young man, he passed away. That says something to me about family. That says something to me about dedication. And this man was a master blacksmith that everyone on the hill knew about. So again, that to me talks about not just Jon Hemings and the Hemings family. It says something to me about the kind of community that Thomas Jefferson, as a private man, was able to surround himself with, even with recalcitrant overseers who did everything that he told them not to do so many times.
So others have pointed out as well that it's likely to be the case that the father of Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, was also the father of Sally Hemings. Do you agree with that observation or likelihood? And when Thomas Jefferson saw Sally Hemings, he in effect saw his wife's half-sister.
There's no way he couldn't. Yes, I agree with that.
So, John, let me ask you a question. You had a night, one time when you were writing your book, you spent the night here.
I did.
So, were there any haunted ghosts or nothing like that? No. Where did you sleep here? I mean, you weren't in Thomas Jefferson's
That's
bed,
a very
I
personal
assume.
question, David. I like to think your gift is going to make it even more comfortable
Right. Okay.
for.
Well, welcome back anytime.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. The Carlisle suite is right there.
Why do you think Thomas Jefferson didn't pursue the highest calling of mankind, private equity?
Yeah, it's a very good one. It's
one of
such
his
a good
failings,
question.
right?
It's such
So-
a good question, and probably more for the afternoon.
So why do you think, what was it like actually
great.
here? What do you think
Well-
was like life in here when he was here?
Well, one of the things, and Leslie and the board were so generous to let me do it. I had to sleep. I slept on the floor in the bedroom. There was an air mattress, which I appreciated very much. And the reason I wanted to do it was he was so. There was nothing accidental about his life. I mean, he was a designer in the sense that he designed a country. He designed, obviously, the world here. And I wanted to feel the way he might have felt as he woke up. He was very proud of the fact that he never slept in. He said that, in fact, the sun had not caught him in bed above 2 or 3 times in many decades. And what I found in sleeping over here was that the house is designed, his bedrooms are such, that the first place the sun hits as the sun comes up is his room. And so he could see the clock in the alcove bed as the rays of the sun came. And I don't think that was accidental. I think there was a passion for life, for all the limitations and shortcomings and sins that we've discussed. There was an engagement in what could a human being get out of existence in a passionate way. It is also true that if you go to the graveyard at the end of the day, by my eye, the last place the sun hits on this part of the mountain is his grave. And again, I don't think that's a mistake either.
So in his bedroom, which was called his sanctum sanctorum, he basically, no one else was allowed in there unless he specifically invited them in. Is that correct?
Except me, that's right.
Right,
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah.
So he kind of kept it to himself. But in his bed, there's a clock that you referred to.
Right.
But every 15 minutes, it made a little noise. So how do you sleep through that?
Right. Well, I think he got up to check the markets. The Bloomberg terminal is right under the John Adams thing. No,
What do you think was most prized possession in here? Of all the things he invented, what do you think was his most prized possession?
That's a wonderful question. I think that his ability to make copies of his letters, which at a very early point, I mean, this was a man who, by the way, expected us to be out here talking about him in the 21st century. Very much so. You know, he and John Adams both began keeping copies of their correspondence in the 1770s. That's someone who expected that there was going to be a papers project. And I think that the written word to him, now this is a writer's view, and I'm sure there are many different arguments to be made, but I think that he appreciated and understood the power of language in a way that I would argue that among his most prized possessions were those things that connected to the act of writing, whether it was the desk made by an enslaved person, whether it was the pens, the eyeglasses, the inkwells.
I see. So Tom, you've interviewed a lot of very famous people, prominent politicians and leaders around the world. If you had a chance to do an interview of Thomas Jefferson, what are the one or two questions you would really like to ask him?
I'd start with race. I would start with race, and writing those ringing words about all men are created equal. But Mr. Jefferson, you keep slaves. They're human beings as well. You've gotten to know them well. How come they're not included as full formed citizens in this country? That would be obviously the first question. And the question that always interests me about people who are of achievement and things, late at night, when you're kind of examining that day or the coming days, what are your flaws? What do you worry about that you have to overcome, that you may not be prepared for? Because it's kind of built into you that you don't do some things as well as you do others. And what are those parts of you that you're still working on? I'd be interested in that.
Rex, how would you compare, you spent a fair amount of your time in your career at Williamsburg, and now you're very familiar with Monticello. How would you compare the two places as historical sites and as a place to visit and learn about colonial times? What are the differences and similarities?
I think Colonial Williamsburg is a small town that was at one point the capital of the Old Dominion. I think that it was a very suburban place with a variety, more diversity of people, more diversity of trades. I think that the politicians were thick in Williamsburg in many ways. I think Monticello was a community. It was an environment. I have enjoyed getting to know the folk at Monticello. As he was talking about Jon Hemings, when he was talking about the writing utensil, I thought to myself, Jon Hemings was the one who probably was making that. Can you imagine Jon saying to himself, now, how do I make what he said he wants? How do I do this? And then he goes home and he talks to Priscilla and he says, do you know what that man wanted me to do today? Or he looks at the, the book stand, because he didn't want to read just one book. He wanted to read 4 or 5 books. So he makes a book stand that's a revolving book stand. And I'm sure Jon said, Priscilla, do you know what he wanted me to do today? I can't even read one book. It'll take me so long to read one book. And this man is reading 5 books at the same time. So when I think about that and the Landau carriage and all of the things that his mind, this active mind of his, constantly was trying to build or get done, because he was a mechanic as well in terms of his abilities, but he knew that he couldn't do it. So Jon was constantly commissioned to do a variety of things that in some way pay homage to this man's voracious mind. And so it is the ability to understand and know that community. Even the little that we say we know about the enslaved community at Monticello, because he owned in his lifetime over 600 enslaved people. We know a lot, quite a bit, more than most places that sort of interpret the colonial period. We know more about Jefferson's community, especially Mulberry Row and those surrounding it, than many other places. Even in Williamsburg, we know a little about a variety of people, but we don't know to the same depth and the same clarity what we know about the folk at Monticello. So getting to understand and know that community, and in many ways having that community speak back to me, just like Jefferson spoke back to Jon that night that he slept. In many ways, they speak back in many, many ways. And it's so fascinating to understand that in order to see Jefferson clearly, I think you have to see him through the lens of his enslaved community, and you learn so much more, I believe.
If Thomas Jefferson cared, John, if Thomas Jefferson cared so much about Monticello, obviously he did,
Yep.
Why did he not leave enough money so that his heirs could actually hold on to it?
That's Leslie asks herself that, I think, most mornings. As Tom said last night, well, I'll let you repeat. If Jefferson had known,
What I said last night was that David arrived 200 years too late. Jefferson should have invested in the Carlyle Fund, and we wouldn't have had all these discussions.
it would be fine. Exactly. one of the many contradictions is one of the themes that runs through the inventions and the commissions is control, often hidden control, right? So dumbwaiters, doors that open but you can't tell exactly how. It's a wonderful metaphor for his political sensibility. He never challenged. People thought, he was duplicitous because he wouldn't contradict you to your face. Again, I don't think that's duplicitous. I just think that's being a politician. But he had an instinct for control, for hidden control, and yet he let the most fundamental, in a way, human issue of control, which is one's finances, go totally to hell.
So, what you're saying,
which is another political instinct.
being duplicitous and being a politician is...
Being duplicitous and being a politician is a very thin line, right? I mean, if you are a clever and successful political actor, your duplicity is forgiven and celebrated. If you happen to be one and then it doesn't work, you become duplicitous.
A final question for you, Tom. You are obviously, I'd say, besieged by people who want you to be involved with lots of different charitable, nonprofit organizations. Why have you chosen to be involved a bit with Monticello? Because you could do so many other things around the country and around the world. What is it about Monticello that you find so compelling?
I'm hoping that some of the Jeffersonian intellect and inquisitiveness and his scientific bent will rub off on me if I come here long enough, quite honestly. I was just sitting here today thinking, God, I've got to do better. I've got to go to the ranch in Montana and pay a lot more attention to the horticulture of the ranch and the weather conditions and know more about the game. I do pay a fair amount of attention to it, but I was trying to imagine if we had Thomas Jefferson come to the American West. We live on the pathway of Lewis and Clark, by the way. I grew up on the Missouri River and then kept moving west, but always in the Lewis and Clark pathway. And the combination of Jefferson's inquisitiveness and their bravery and their scientific bent as well has always been inspirational to me. So I come here to be infused in a way with more curiosity and with a kind of kickstart to what little intellectual bent I bring to any enterprise that I'm involved in, because he's the perfect example of not only a great citizen, and as Jon has written so well, a complete politician, but also a man who would then return to his passions, and we're all the better off for it. And I hope, that I'll come out of here with a little more of that in my own veins.
So let me take the prerogative of the moderator to just make a concluding comment. We're out of time, and I would just say that one of the most famous quotes from President Kennedy was a quote that he gave at the time that the American Nobel Prize winners were brought together in the White House. I think it was in 1962. And he said to all these American Nobel Prize winners, there hasn't been so much intellect in this place since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Making it clear that he was a great admirer of the incredible intellect of Thomas Jefferson. And I would say President Kennedy was not a bad writer himself, and he was pretty good with a phrase. And like Thomas Jefferson, he tended to give poetry in prose form, which is really what I think to some extent the preamble of the Constitution, preamble of the Declaration of Independence is. And in his famous inaugural address, which I regard as poetry in prose form, at the end of it, President Kennedy said, not the line that's the most famous one, but he said, with a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. It's my view that those of you who are supporting Monticello and Thomas Jefferson's legacy are doing God's work on earth. And I want to thank all of you who are doing that. And I would just say that while I can't guarantee it, it is my theory that those people who do support God's work on earth will get to heaven more quickly. So now, again, I can't prove that. And if you support Monticello in the capital campaign and so forth, I can't guarantee you'll get to heaven more quickly, but why would you want to take a chance? So, and I hope everybody here learned a lot more about Thomas Jefferson and Monticello, and now enthusiastic about being even greater supporters. Thank you all.